Friends, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this Asia Pacific Forum 2018. It is one of the important initiatives, and I would call CEO and Jeff to give you some idea. RIS, as you know, has been partnering with this idea of evolving the various facets and elements of Indo-Pacific as we describe it. RIS also hosts the ASEAN India Center, and our interest in pursuing our partnership with ASEAN goes back to 1992 when Sectoral Dialogue Partnership was initiated. Since then, several studies and projects have been undertaken for consolidating our collective understanding, providing policy inputs to Ministry of External Affairs and other line ministries as we have moved on for exploring the nuances of India's engagement with the region. And with our Look East policy, things further precipitated in the early 90s, and then now when the current dispensation came up in 2014, India announced what is called as Act East policy. It was almost the same time in 2013 when RIS established the ASEAN India Center to bring in the heft that it is required in terms of empirical-based analysis of India's international trade, investment, and technology cooperation. Friends, as you would agree, this is the time as we are all getting set for Asian century, which would be extremely inclusive process in the history of time, where we would be bringing in almost all the countries together as part of our collective commitment for sustainable development goals, where no one should be left behind. And fortunately or unfortunately, the geopolitics is also emerging in a manner where Asian countries would be playing an extremely important role to make this planet more inclusive, to bring in Asian ethos, values, and our approaches on geopolitics together. And that provides the traction that the very Asia-Pacific Forum tries to bring on the table. We are joined in here by several countries, and this is also the time RIS is hosting an ITEC program. As some of you know, India's Ministry of External Affairs has a flagship program called Indian Technical and Economic Cooperation Program. Under that, we bring in diplomats, academics, and others from different parts of the country. At this point in RIS, we are hosting a 2-week course on South-South cooperation. There could not have been a better occasion than this to bring all the participants, and they are 32 participants from 22 countries. And this brings in, and they are from Latin America, they are from Africa, they are from Asia, and we are so glad that they could also join in for this open public dialogue that the forum would hold. The practice has been, and fortunately for last 3 forums I have been participating, RIS has been a founder member of this. Under this, what happens is the first day is open public session in which invited speakers interact with the open platform, at the open platform with people, those who are participating. And then next day is a closed door session where we take up possible researchable areas, and then that's the group of researchers. This meeting is scheduled for tomorrow, first half, where researchers would be sitting down, identifying key areas of research. But now, without further ado, I would like to invite Kazumasa Kasuka-san, Chairman and CEO of the JEF, for giving his welcome remarks. Sir, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. This is Kusaka of the Japan Economic Foundation. For Excellency, Preeti, Saran, Ambassador Amar Sinha, Dr. Sachin Chaturvedi, Director General of RIS, which is our co-host, to all of the experts from the Asia-Pacific region who have gathered here today, and to distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. I am truly honored to be here today and have this opportunity to greet you. We at the Japan Economic Foundation have been hosting dialogues with Asia, the United States, and Europe in order to achieve sustainable growth in the regions. And in recent years, we have been taking up constraining factors to such growth and have sought its solutions and learned from each other on the policy successes and failures. We began our first Asia-Pacific Forum in 2003 in Singapore to promote FTAs in this region. This year marks the 17th annual forum. The venue for this year's forum, India, has promoted not only the software industry, but also IT, robotics, and Make in India. And under the initiative of Prime Minister Modi, its ranking in ease of doing business greatly improved. India is the most fitting location to talk about free trade and investment and Industry 4.0. I'd like to express my gratitude to RIS for agreeing to co-host this year's symposium. Since our first symposium in 2003, discussions have kept pace with the progress of economic integration within ASEAN, who holds a central role in the integration process of this region. And it has expanded from border measures such as custom duties to domestic systems and its practice, which are called behind the border measures. These deep liberalization has an element of affecting our daily life, society, and industries. We have learned from members on how each of their nations and regions addressing these issues. In this region, TPP, from which the US has decided to withdraw, will become effective as TPP 11 on December 30. Negotiations for agreement on RCEP is also at a period where it requires the most difficult, most critical political leadership, just like one step away from the peak of Mount Everest, but most dangerous moment when climbing up the very challenging mountain. On the other hand, in Western nations, as the expression, everything is globalized except our consent, accurately represents globalization is causing a mutiny in the form of refusal to consent from its constituents, leading to a phenomenon where political leadership of democratic nations is swayed by these huge movements. This can be seen with the US withdrawal from the EU, which was thought to be the model of regional economic integration. The US has also fallen into protectionism, as represented by the America First policy. Increasingly, globalization is considered to be the root cause of the growing income and asset disparities, or undesired movement of people. But is globalization to blame for the decreasing number of workers Indeed, parts and components come from all over the world as part of the global supply chain and value chain brought on by free trade and investment through FTA, which is an institutional aspect of globalization, or is technological innovation, such as AI and robotics, causing a major social transformation. The first industrial revolution faced conservative reaction from the Luddite movement. Yet, we also know that historically, technology has created more jobs through economic growth. Is Industry 4.0 different from the past revolutions with its speed and magnitude? For economic growth to absorb shadow of globalization and Industry 4.0, there is a need for institutions, namely Bretton Woods system and other international public goods, to evolve. We need to restore trust and confidence in these institutions. Whether one likes or not, globalization will continue to progress. And with Industry 4.0, each country is required to face the problems of disparities and poverty. Inclusive growth will be a major challenge in pursuing regional integration. The process to cope with this challenge is something similar to creating a new domestic social contract. In other words, each country is required to create a better globalization. For the growth strategy for this region to succeed, I think it is essential that we cooperate with each other and promote mega FTAs. Since the US leadership is now hospitalized for a while, I think it is our region that must take on the role of the promoter of free trade and take action for economic integration. I end my remarks by hoping that today's forum will further strengthen our bond in this region, promote economic integration, and contribute to the sustainable development of our economies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Mr. President Kusaka-san, for your remarks. Thanks for bringing out the importance, relevance, and centrality of multilateralism in our system. I have now great pleasure in inviting Ambassador Amar Sinha, who is Distinguished Fellow at RIS. After superannuating in 2017 with his distinguished service of 35 years in Ministry of External Affairs, he has joined RIS, but he is also on board of several other entities. More important, I consider, is his being with the board of Barefoot College, and this is one extremely important organization. I would request him to elaborate on that a bit for benefit of everyone. But he is also on board of Hindustan Petroleum Corporation, which is another major public sector enterprise. He was India's ambassador in Indonesia, and he also served in Afghanistan. So he understands the challenges of conflict and the dangers of exclusions that our world processes lead to. And now I would like to invite Ambassador Amar Sinha.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I didn't know that I had to make a speech. First of all, greetings to President Kusaka, my dear friend and batchmate Preeti Saran, and DG Sachin Chaturvedi, and all the dignitaries here. Today, of course, RIS, on behalf of RIS, I must express my happiness that the Japan Economic Foundation has chosen us as their partner to host this forum in Delhi. We feel that it is not only timely, it's a very, very important initiative. Particularly so because India not only is a big economy and fairly globalized, but also it has a different perspective and a view on multilateralism and the way it has evolved. Let us look at the theme: geopolitics, trade, technology, and integration. If you actually go through these words, you would see that more than integration, each one of them have also become a source of division in the global context. And of course, we will be discussing the role of technology and the intellectual property regime and how it has affected developing countries in terms of creating. But I'll leave it for the next session. He mentioned something in terms of Barefoot College, where I'm helping them in whatever little way I could. Barefoot College is a unique South-South sort of cooperative initiative, in fact, which India took the lead with some social entrepreneurs, famously Mr. Bankar Roy. I don't know how many of you have heard. But basically it proves just two things. It proves that the monopoly of technology or technical knowledge does not rest with people who come with technical degrees. And it actually proves it on ground, because what it does, its main thrust or the major program that it runs is called the Solar Mama program, where it brings in uneducated women, mainly grandmothers, without any degree, from different countries. They are put together for a 6-month course together in a place called Tilonia near Jaipur. And in 6 months, these women who have had no formal education go back as trained solar technicians. And they not only acquire this ability and this expertise, but they go back and actually light up homes. And today we are very proud that there are nearly 3,000 solar mamas around the world, in most of the developing countries in Africa, Asia Pacific, in our own region. And together they are producing nearly 1,400 megawatts of electricity, which is what perhaps a small-sized nuclear plant produces. And that is no mean achievement. And in fact, if you just Googled Barefoot College, and you will find a number of videos from Guatemala, from Zambia, and Sierra Leone of these women who have done. But besides making them engineers, we also empower them in terms of giving them 3 skills. We make them small entrepreneurs. We give them education on personal health and hygiene, which is something that they also lack besides electricity in the villages. And we train them in basic accountancy and bookkeeping so that they can actually run an enterprise. And that, I think, is also a great sign of globalization at a micro level, which at least the large corporations miss. And I have always said that these are really the foot soldiers of an institution. We started this Solar Mama program 10 years ago. And it was only after 10 years that India thought of setting up this International Solar Alliance. So, but we had started creating the foot soldiers of this Solar Alliance, perhaps maybe not connected, but 10 years ago. So I would leave it at that, and I would just introduce our main speaker, Preeti Saran, we have been together in the service since 1982. We, of course, started together, and I am very happy that we also ended together our innings, in a sense that both of us worked at the ministry together. I, of course, am older, so I retired a year before she did, and she has been out of the government precisely for 7 weeks. And before this, she was in charge of what exactly we are looking at, the geography, Asia Pacific. She was Secretary East, and if you look east from India right to the coast of South America was her domain. And everything you see between India and Latin America she was in charge of all the countries in the region, and that is the remit of Secretary East, which is half the world, as we say. So Preeti, without much further ado, let me invite you to address this gathering and deliver your keynote address. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Amar, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, RIS and Jeff, for organizing this symposium and for inviting me to share my thoughts on this very important topic on protecting the global trading system and the role for multilateralism. Quite apart from the fact that as Secretary East, I looked after the Indo-Pacific region. So in terms of political, strategic aspects of the relationship, yes, I could make a comment, but I can see from the experts sitting here and what I've read about the information of the participants, clearly I am amidst trade experts and economists, and since I am neither claim to be either a trade expert or an economist, I will try to give my own perspective, an Indian perspective on how we see the evolution of the global trading system and the role for multilateralism, especially in the current context where there are frictions in the global consensus building efforts and they are multiplying each day. Of course, the latest in the series of the events that have led to apprehensions and uncertainty comes from the recently concluded APEC summit that was held in Papua New Guinea. The Asia-Pacific leaders who participated in the summit, for the first time, failed to come to an agreement on a joint communique. This is the first time in the history of APEC, as deep fault lines emerged between the United States and China over issues of trade. And while reports of a trade war between these two big trading giants have been in the news for quite some time, what made the APEC case interesting is the breakdown of consensus over issues that concern the reforms of the WTO. And the WTO has been the most robust and vibrant institution for multilateral trade negotiation that evolved to some form of maturity and is now experiencing a virtual free fall. And for an Indian professional diplomat to actually wax eloquent on the efficacy of WTO just shows how far we have come from the times when we negotiated and participated in the Uruguay rounds or the Doha development round, where we failed to get that basic policy space or the special and differential treatment that India and Indian delegation or other developing country nations were constantly struggling to achieve in these negotiations. And therefore, much of the failure of the WTO can be attributed to unfulfilled commitments on the part of the developed world, issues of special and differential treatment for developing countries, failure to close the Doha round, and opening up of new areas of multilateral trade negotiations, which actually had very little to do with trade and went way beyond, including, for example, when it came to TRIPS and the flexibilities that developing countries fought for, or whether there was the policy space that we struggled in, or a sister organization when it came to TRIPS negotiations was the World Intellectual Property Organization, where again developing countries had to fight and struggle to lodge a development agenda into those TRIPS plus kind of negotiations that we had to struggle with. However, today, the disengagement and going back on abandoned strategies of trade protectionism are a recent phenomenon, and they're not coming out of these developing countries who actually struggle for that policy space, and therefore it is a disturbing trend. Unilateralism or unilateral trade arrangements that give unfair advantages to a few or distort the markets are equally reprehensible. This goes fundamentally against the assertions about free trade, particularly at a juncture when developing countries at large have started to see trade integration as an opportunity rather than a challenge. And I again reiterate that it was a huge challenge for developing countries, including India, that had remained a closed economy, where levels of development of our economies, there was no parity at all, none whatsoever. For us to have kept pace with and harmonized our rules, our regulations, was a challenge itself. And then suddenly we find that it is not the developing countries that are challenging the whole process, but the challenges are coming from elsewhere. That said, the successful conclusion of the Trade Facilitation Agreement was a confirmation of the belief that when countries agreed to walk the extra mile to streamline processes, that could allow for deeper trade integration. The TFA, which is the Trade Facilitation Agreement, came about in times at the WTO platform when regionalism and bilateral trade agreements have already picked steam. However, failure in consensus building efforts on several occasions, increasingly because of disagreement between two of the leading economies, have caused severe stress for the global recovery. It has also failed to take cognizance of the fact that growth nodes of the world economy has now got more distributed, and many southern economies, both big and small, are in fact driving GDP growth and world trade. Another disturbing development has been the clever strategies to leverage this growth potential of smaller economies by institutionalizing new aid packages in the form of mega connectivity projects and infrastructure projects that is having the exact opposite impact of their growth potential for these very smaller countries. The initial promise of greater connectivity and robust infrastructure is running the danger of pushing countries into indebtedness towards a few countries compromising sovereignty and democratic participation in the 21st century world order that is strongly believed would be more accommodating than that of the last century. The rise of the Asia-Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific as we would prefer to call it, is currently real and it is durable. However, conflicts of interest and at times deliberate attempts at deepening of conflicts in the region have made sober nations worried. The RCEP negotiations among the 16 countries in the Indo-Pacific are taking place against this background. From a political and a strategic perspective, India being a member of RCEP is natural and something that will further reinforce India's Act East policy. It will also give a boost to the concept of the Indo-Pacific as an inclusive, open, rules-based order, and it could help strengthen the economic pillar of our relations with the East and Southeast Asia, and also perhaps take the people-to-people relations to a higher level. And this was reconfirmed and reiterated by our Prime Minister most recently when he participated in the RCEP summit in Singapore. That said, whether it is the WTO Doha round, or whether it's the RCEP negotiations, or whether there are other trading arrangements that India has been participating in, call it Mercosur with the Latin American region, or with the ASEAN countries, the FTA, or even SAFTA closer home, with the SAARC, within the SAARC framework, where India, because of its immediate neighborhood involved, and in spite of the fact that one member of the SAFTA negotiations refused to actually honor the commitments it had undertaken in SAFTA, and where India, again, as the biggest country in the entire grouping, had in fact made unilateral concessions to the least developed countries of the grouping. We must, as Indian negotiators, as Indian experts, as Indian economists, certainly take, I think, a deeper look, even as we participate in all of these plurilateral or multilateral trade arrangements. Certainly take an assessment, maybe a performance audit, of where we stand as far as the global trading system is concerned, and whether it has worked well for us. And it is against this background that I thought I'd just share some of my thoughts, which I thought will kickstart discussions in the subsequent segments that you would undertake. it is my belief that India definitely has benefited and performed better whenever it has traded with the world. And therefore, it is certainly in India's interest to ensure a rules-based multilateral trading system with equal and equitable burden sharing. After all, nations trade not for trade's sake, but as a means to development, and therefore it is important for trading nations to assess their comparative advantages while seeking market access or while negotiating. And therefore, unilateral moves or anything that distorts trade from the natural comparative advantages that countries enjoy in such trading arrangements is naturally a cause of concern. Of course, trade negotiations are complex, and trade negotiators naturally have to assess that while making their commitments, they remain mindful of the sensitive sectors. For example, in India, it is the agriculture sector, it is the small and micro sectors which create jobs for the poorest segments of the community that are of serious concern to us. And that has, of course, been a concern to us throughout the Uruguay round, the Doha round, or elsewhere as well, whether it was a participation in the RCEP or other negotiations. And I recall that when I was posted in Geneva, and as the delegate to UNCTAD representing India, a constant refrain that I heard amongst the developing country delegates was about the subsidies, that again they were trade distorting subsidies, where it was the developed rich countries that had subsidized their farmers and their farming sector so heavily and were expecting, constantly badgering the developing countries to open up our agriculture sector. And I remember at that time some of the negotiators repeatedly reiterating that I would rather be a cow in Europe than a poor farmer in India or any other developing country. Such was the nature of these trade distortions. And so when it comes to Government of India taking a very rigid position on negotiations in very sensitive sectors, like agriculture or the micro and medium enterprise sectors, I think it is important for all of us who are participating here to remain mindful of that very important element, because these are directly linked to livelihood issues of the poorest segments of the community. And therefore, while governments must support these sensitive sectors, it is, I think, not in our interest to make them so dependent that they fail to remain competitive or they even fail to launch themselves. Similarly, comes to the small and micro and medium enterprise, I think to the extent that we can support them evolve, it is important. I recall again my days in Geneva, where there was an anticipation and expectation that after the textiles agreement, where the quota-free regime would have been removed, and India would have been perhaps the biggest beneficiary, because we would have perhaps, having a complete value chain of the entire textiles and apparel sector benefited. Somehow, I think we got our story not quite right, and failed to remain competitive. And there are others, including our immediate neighborhood, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Vietnam, and others. I can talk of so many other very successful stories about how they did better and what is it that India could learn from those stories as well. Another area of concern, of course, for us is the growing trade deficit, especially with China. And so while you would hear experts again talk in terms of trade deficit, or export need not necessarily be counted only in terms of your exports and imports, and sometimes it's good to be part of the value chains. It's good to encourage and allow competition, and imports is not such a bad thing, because it gives your population access to, of course, cheaper goods and helps you be part of the entire value chain as well. I think we need to take cognizance where a trade deficit continues to grow to the tune of $60 billion, and then India fails to get that kind of desired market access from a country such as China. And so it is, I think, and I hope that this symposium certainly the Indian members or the experts in India, would be able to take a hard look at where is it that India has gone wrong, what is it that we could do better, maybe some kind of a performance audit, on whether the efficacy of the WTO or other plurilateral arrangements, including the ASEAN-India FTA. The sense we get is that perhaps we have not benefited as much, because it was our expectation that when we negotiated the ASEAN-India FTA in goods, we would have expected services and investments as well to have been honored and committed and implemented, but that has not happened. And meanwhile, the RCEP negotiations have started, where there is once again pressure for India to price open segments like goods, but then the negotiating countries perhaps are not giving us as much comfort on other segments, including services and investments. So we need to, I think, and I would urge all the participants today to perhaps have a look at this and see whether these plurilateral arrangements, whether it's WTO, the ASEAN FTA, or even the various CICA arrangements that India has with Singapore, with ROK, with Thailand, which have moved at different stages of being discussed, and whether they have really helped us, or whether there requires a course correction for India and for other participating countries. And of course, the course correction need not necessarily all be external, and I'm not going to just blame the external trading partners or the negotiating partners in it. I think we need to also take a hard-nosed look at our own ability and whether we have somehow, by overprotecting, not failed ourselves, or not protected the right elements and perhaps failed ourselves. Why is it that we've not become part of the value chains? And then, given the fact that, apart from trade negotiations and participating in the global trade system, we talk about our strengths being the demographic dividend. And whether by protecting ourselves, we are not keeping some of our population actually deprived of access to various goods. Especially, for example, if you were to look at other middle-income countries beyond India, and see their requirements of energy needs or nutrition needs, and whether we have actually been too protectionist and that is the reason for it, or otherwise. These are just some of the thoughts that I just thought I'd just share with you. It's not for me to give the solutions to it. I think it's really for the experts present here today. But I would definitely like to thank JEF and RIS for having organized this very important aspect. It certainly has a bearing for India, as we aspire to transform ourselves into a modern society and leapfrog into the knowledge economy of the 21st century. And our efforts at fundamental transformations domestically are matched with greater efforts in contributing to consolidation of the global governance regimes around multilateralism. Thank you.
Thanks, ma'am. Thanks, Ambassador Saran, for extremely rich and extremely comprehensive address today. You very rightly pointed out importance of services sector. As you might have noticed in this program, we have a specific session on trade and also on services sector, giving its importance not only for India but also for ASEAN countries. You also emphasized on centrality of multilateral institutions. Fortunately, next month when Japan would take over presidency of G20, Japan has already identified two very important themes out of the 5. One is on the issue related to centrality of multilateralism, and second, again you captured in your address, is rising indebtedness of the countries. So that's a specific theme which Japan has identified as a priority area for G20 discussion. In fact, the academic forum is meeting in Tokyo on 4th and 5th of December. Friends, with this we come to close of our inaugural session. As you might have seen in the agenda, there is a brief photo session. So the participants from the ASEAN countries who are here as delegates for Asia Pacific Forum, I would like to request them to come here on the dais. As Secretary East, Ambassador Preeti Saran is sitting here. We would have a group photo with her and with other dignitaries on the dais. Please join us here for group photo.